Hey, how you getting on? I'm Bald, and these are a bunch of power tubes, and I want to find out if they sound different in the Hughes and Kettner Triamp Mark III. So a little while ago, I made a long video about the Hughes and Kettner Triamp Mark III where I demoed it extensively and I showed most of its functions. One of the interesting functions here is the power tube switching. It has 6 power tubes that are grouped in pairs, 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and 5 and 6. And one of the cool features of the Triamp is you can switch those individually via MIDI. So you can have just one pair active, effectively making it a sort of 50 watt amp, 2 for 100 watts and 3 for 150 watts. And stock this amp comes with 2 EL34s and 4 6L6s. And in the video, I demonstrated how that sounds. I switched between the 2 6L6s, didn't sound any different. And then I switched between one of the 6L6s and the EL34s, and that sounded quite drastically different. And seeing as how we're in 2026 and we need to condense information down into bite-sized nuggets for people with TikTok attention spans, I made a couple of shorts and reels, whatever you call them, for the different platforms, and one was about that switching. And I got a bunch of comments from people who know it better saying, it's just volume difference. And yeah, volume differences probably played a part in that perception, but I'm not sure if it's all of that because it took both pairs of 6L6s to sound about as loud as the EL34s. I think there might have been a bit of an EQ difference after all, and that's what I want to test today. Because another cool thing about the Hughes and Kettner Triamp Mark III is an auto bias function. You can pop matched pairs of tubes in here, and if you turn it off, put it on standby, and then switch it on and wait exactly 3 minutes, it will bias the amp. And I've been talking about a tube test for years now, and maybe someday I'll get to it. This is kind of a small pre-test. I'm getting my feet a little bit wet. So I'm going to pop these different power tube pairs in, reamp a riff, and then we'll switch back and forth at my desk over there, look at frequency response graphs, and then maybe we'll normalize them as well to eliminate the volume differences to see if there's an EQ difference as well. The Hughes and Kettner Triamp Mark III also has a power amp insert. I'll be doing some frequency response graph sweeps with Room EQ Wizard as well. Yeah. Anyway, lost my train of thought there for a sec. The tubes we'll be using. Well, the Triamp Mark III comes stock with 4 Tube Amp Doctor red bass 6L6s and 2 red bass EL34s. And I've got here a matched pair of JJ6CA7s, which are from the EL34 family. Supposedly these sound somewhere between 6L6 and EL34. So I've got Electro-Harmonic 6550s, the big bottles. I've got a pair of JJ KT88s, also big bottles. Then these are Tube Amp Doctor 5881s. Those are tubes from the 6L6 family. Just lower plate dissipation, 25 watts instead of 30 watts per tube, I think. And then finally, one of my favorites, JJ KT77s. I'm going to pop them all in, reamp a riff, do the Room EQ Wizard sweeps, and then I'll meet you at my desk. Let's see if I can keep this video under half an hour for a change. Let's go. The cool thing about this, to the magic of editing, I can frame this like I'm right anyway. If there's no tonal difference, I can graciously agree that those people were right. Even though I got no comment like that on the long video, only on the shorts. But if there is an EQ difference, I'm going to shit on these people mercilessly. Righto, I've reamped a riff through all 7 power tube pairs using channel 2B of the Hughes and Kettner Triamp Mark III, and I've done a Room EQ Wizard sweep just using the power amp, using the master, the power amp insert on the back of the amplifier. The riff I used sounds like this. You get the idea. And these are the recordings. And you can see there are quite large volume differences between them. We have EL34 here, 6L6, 5181, 5881, sorry, KT77, KT88, 6CA7, my phone fell over, and 6550s. You can see that the tubes from the 6L6 family, 6L6 and 5881s, seem quite a bit more quiet than the ones from the EL34 family, which are EL34, KT77, and 6CA7. KT88 seems to be similarly loud as the EL34 family tubes. And then there's 6550, which is super loud here. And at first I thought that was pretty cool. But later on, when I was resetting the amp, putting it back in stock configuration, I wanted to auto bias the stock tube configuration. I noticed that 2 power tube LEDs were on, the first and the middle one. So I think I screwed that up. That was user error on my part.
that's probably 6550 and EO34, so a quad of tubes. So not really qualified for us to find the differences between EO34s and 6550s, but still usable for the test because, yeah, maybe a quad of tubes sounds different than a pair of tubes. Here's what I've planned. I've got two tracks here, one reference track and another track. The reference is always going to be the EO34 pairs, so we'll be comparing different powered tube pairs to EO34s always. So we have, and I've normalized them. This first track is not normalized, and to eliminate differences that might be perceived due to different volumes, I've normalized all the tracks going forward. I'm using Voxengo Span Plus to show you the differences in frequency response, and I'll be using Nugent Audio's A/B Assist 2 to switch back and forth between the power tube pairs. Let's start with EL34 versus 6L6. A is EL34 always, and B is always the other pair. EL34s is going to be red in this graph, and blue will be the others. So 6L6 versus EL34s without normalizing. So quite a difference there. But after normalizing, you can see in square parenthesis here, the difference between those two is about 4 decibels. If we normalize those tracks in AB again, I don't know about you guys, but I can't hear a differdifference, and the graphs are pretty much identical. They're absolutely on top of each other. Let's compare EL34s to 5881s. No idea why that's so hard to say for me today. Pretty much the same. EL34s versus KT77s. EL34s versus KT88s. EL34s versus 6CA7s. Again, much of the same. Let's compare EL34s to that botched 6550 test. So probably EL34s versus EL34s and 6550s. And that's the only one where I think I hear the tiniest bit of difference, but I'm not sure if that's an actual difference or if that's just suggestion, because I can see in the graphs that there's just the tiniest sliver of difference between, the low ends of those two tracks. Yeah, so it looks like the people making those comments on my short were right, which I knew, of course. I was always of that opinion. I just didn't like the way they said it. No, honestly, I can't hear any difference. There seems to be a slightly, yes, at the tiniest bit of difference in the graphs, especially in the last one. Just for the sake of completion, let's increase the block size in Voxengo Span Plus, because at the moment, I've got it set to, I need to close this for a sec. Sorry. I've got it set to 2048, and block size, yeah, you could think of that as the resolution of the graph. Let's up that to 16,384 in both instances of the plugin. I have to do that in both instances, otherwise one graph will be very squiggly and the other one will be very smooth, to see if we can make out more differences there. I'm going to max that out. And with that resolution, or with that block size, the graph gets quite a bit choppy. I think that demands a lot of processing power. The frequency response still looks very much the same, but the transients might be the tiniest bit different. Although I'm not sure if that is an actual difference or if that's just delay in processing of the computer. Yeah, they look pretty much the same. Now, before we move on to Room EQ Wizard, I want to do one thing that was a bit of an afterthought in my last tube test. In my last tube test, I compared 3 different pairs, no quads of tube amp Doctor to EL34s. And with the A/B testing, like I just did now, I didn't hear much of a difference, if any. But later in the Null testing, there was quite a noticeable difference. And since then, I've thought about that in a bit, and I'm not quite sure if Null testing, at least in this context, is the right means to highlight differences between 2 sound samples like this. I think a null test might be suitable to point out if there's no difference or very little difference, but it's not a useful means to determine, to actually quantify qualitative that doesn't make no sense. So I'm going to shut off the plugins AB Assist and Voxengo Span Plus, and I'm going to flip the phase on the other track. So EL34 6L6 null test. I hear a very quiet guitar track. What's funny is the volume seems to swell at one stage and go back down again. And that's what I mean. There might be some phase relationships there that might not always be consistent. EO34 versus 5881s. We didn't have it there. EO34 versus KT77s. We get some crackles and pops there with the very quiet guitar sound. I hope you can hear the guitar sound even on YouTube. It reminds me of an old record player. EO34s and KT88s. Very similar to the KT77s. EO34s and 6CA7s. The crackling is louder than the guitar signal we're left with. EL34s versus botched 6550s. Lots of crackles and still a very quiet guitar signal, but I think it's a bit louder than with the other ones, which kind of supports what I believe to have seen in the graphs. Now, before I try to salvage this somehow and draw any meaningful conclusions, let's look at the Room EQ Wizard graphs. So I've got all the graphs here. Go to all SPL. That looks a little messy, but we'll make some sense out of it later. Down here in red and orange, you see the 2 tubes from the 6L6 family, which are 5881s and 6L6. In the middle, we have EL34s, KT77s, 6CA7s, and I believe KT77s in this. That's not petrol. I'll have to ask my wife what color that is, that greenish bluish thing. And up here we have what was probably the botched 6550 test. So one thing is fairly consistent, that is that the ER34 family tubes seem to be a good, what do we have here? 89, 93, about 4 dB louder than tubes from the EL34 family in the Hughes and Kettner Triamp Mark III. Now, the graphs all look very similar, but are there differences? And Room EQ Wizard has a pretty cool tool for us to find that out, which is SPL align, a bit like normalizing in the DAW. And we can even choose the frequency, which is supposed to be the alignment center. Let's align them at 1 kilohertz. And one thing that is immediately noticeable is the KT88s between about 600 and maybe 150, between 150, 200. Yeah, let's say 200 to 600 hertz. The KT88 seems to be a lot louder, about 2 dB louder than all the other ones. And we didn't hear that in the test, and I couldn't see that in Voxengo Span Plus. And that's pretty much the first time that Room EQ Wizard and Voxengo Span Plus have delivered different results in one of my tests. what could the possible explanations for this be? Well, maybe the amp is operated differently, but maybe the amp is operated differently depending on if I use it as a regular amp with the input or if I tap straight into the power amp. The power tubes might react differently to different signal levels here. Might have been just a glitch. Maybe for a very short moment I had higher wall voltage. I don't know. Anyway, note for future testing is do several room EQ wizard sweeps with the same parameters or the same power tubes when we're talking about tube testing. But anyway, the rest of these, and also the KT88s above 600 hertz, are pretty much dead on. That looks very similar. In the low mids, we see some slight differences here between KT77 and the rest of them. But what's the order of magnitude? 94 dB here. And that is 94.5. That's half a dB. That's not a lot. And the rest of them are pretty much grouped within 0.2, 0.3 dBs here. That is not what I expected, to be honest. I thought there'd be, well, I didn't expect earth-shattering differences, much like I did in the last Power Amp 2 test, but I did expect bigger differences than that. So let's try to make sense of that. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, the more I test power tubes, at least, the more it seems like Glenn Fricker was right about power tubes. I'm not 100% convinced yet because this is a specific result and we can't argue from the specific to the general. It seems the way I use the Hughes and Kettner Triamp Mark III, the choice of power tubes does not affect the overall tone of the amp in any meaningful way, but the volume. But that's still a useful tool in an amp for gigging. Yeah, for gigging purposes, especially if you want to give yourself a solo boost, you might want to switch in 2 extra power tubes, for example. However, different power tubes might still react differently in different amps or amps with different negative feedback loops. In general, maybe these would react differently if we had resonance and presence maxed or on 0, in fact. I had the amp set the way I use it, so on that amp, resonance and presence at about noon, roughly. And in further testing, there's other parameters that we need to consider as well. And one thing is volume or signal level hitting the power amp. So is the power amp in overdrive? Is it so loud that the power amp begins to distort, basically? And I think that's where bias comes in as well. Before that, I suspect bias isn't really that important. I don't think it will affect the overall sound as long as we're amplifying clean, so clean sine waves. But bias is another interesting topic because, yeah, I was talking to Mario from Tube Workshop about that, and he pointed out one very interesting thing when it comes to bias, because in pretty much every guitar tube amp I know, the power rail, if you can call it that, is in sequence. It starts at the power tube, and after that it goes to the phase inverter, and then it goes all the way down to the input of the amp, to V1, the input stage of the amp. So the tubes in a guitar amp, they're kind of daisy-chained to each other. First in line when it comes to the power is the power tubes, and if I were to increase the bias voltage there, that would mean that the preamp tubes see lower voltages. And if I lower the voltage of the power section, or the bias, then the preamp tubes would see higher voltages. And what Mario theorized is that that change in preamp voltage due to different power amp bias settings might affect the feel and the tone of the amp more than the actual bias setting of the power amp itself. But that is something that's almost impossible to isolate. So that's something to think of as well. I'm not sure where I'm going to go with this. I just thought it was a very interesting thought to mention. So yeah, further testing needed to isolate certain parameters. At the same time, I'm not really sure how that would help us anymore. Definitely want to test a few other circuits and mess with the negative feedback, but I'm not sure how important, overall volume is, because modern amps aren't really designed to have the power amp really have the bejesus cranked out of it. We don't really want power amp distortion in modern amps, not in modern metal amps anyway. So if you're using something like a Triamp Mark III or an Engel Savage or a EVH 5150 that way with the power amp holding on for dear life, that's kind of odd. in older amp designs like Plexis, JCM 800s, yes, it might play a role there, but in modern amps, probably not so much. So yeah, a bit of a head scratcher there. Didn't expect that result. The guys commenting on the shorts were apparently right, at least according to this test. Maybe there are some methodological errors in my testing. If so, if you have any ideas, please leave comments down below. Yeah, to quote one of my favorite TV shows, and on this terrible disappointment, it's time to end. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye-bye.